Welcome back to another episode of OKOGA Live. I'm Chad Warmington, president of the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association. Have a fantastic guest with me this week, our state's Attorney General, Mike Hunter. Mike, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
Living in interesting times right now. I was looking, there's an old Chinese curse, not a proverb, a curse. And it says, may you live in interesting times. And I've never understood why it was a curse until now. Living in interesting times here, aren't we?
You can say that again. Well, I guess another remark is apt here. Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government,
yes,
except for all the
except
other
for all the others.
So
that's right.
We got a lot of democracy going on these days.
Well, democracy's loud, and it's a little noisy and a little chaotic sometimes, and I think that's what we're seeing.
True.
But it's a good sign of a healthy engagement, and I think we're happy about that, and that's a good thing.
Agreed.
So, speaking of kind of government and things you haven't seen before, I mean, you have a really interesting history in Oklahoma, and a long and varied level of experience. And so I really wanted to start out with that. Kind of take us back to the beginning for you in public service, and then you know you've been in Oklahoma, you left, you've come back, you've served different roles. So give us kind of the Mike Hunter summary of your different experience in state government politics.
I'm afraid I'm going to put everybody to sleep.
But it's really interesting though, so I think it's important to cover.
Okay. Well, I grew up on a farm up in Garfield County outside of Enid near the metropolis of Waukomis, wheat and cattle farm. Oklahoma State undergrad, OU Law, was a practicing attorney for a number of years, served in the legislature, served a 6-year sentence in the legislature back in the 80s.
I think some of your colleagues now are thinking about that are in the House.
It felt like alumni. It, so I'm sure it feels like it now. But I was privileged to be the general counsel at the Corporation Commission, and was involved in regulating oil and gas. I went from being an oil and gas attorney to regulating oil and gas companies, so that was an interesting transition. Worked for Congressman Watts for a number of years, great guy. Frank Keating, I was his Secretary of State during his second term. And then I went to Washington with Frank, and we managed the life insurance trade and then the Bankers Association for a number of years. And we'd been splitting time, my wife and I, Cheryl, who's also an attorney here in Oklahoma City, and it just, it got to the point about 3.5 years ago when it was time to be in Oklahoma all the time. So I moved back and was, had an opportunity to go to work for Scott Pruitt as his first assistant. And the election occurred back in 2016, and he went to Washington, and I got this job. So my joke is that Scott got demoted, and I got the good job.
There you go. That's true. He jumped into the fire. And
he did.
You got to stay home.
He did.
So tell me, now you also did you do a stint at the Commission of Land Office as well?
I did. I was executive director at the Land Office after a $1 million embezzlement.
Yes.
And so I was able to put a really good team together. We went in and overhauled the place and rewrote the statutes, worked with you some.
Yeah.
When you were a top staffer in the House. So that was a good experience, and you know, it was a neat opportunity to go and fix something that was broken.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the hallmark of what you've done. You've been able to be in positions where you could go really make a difference and make a change. And I think that's one of the things that that sometimes people fear in Oklahoma. But change is a good thing. We need to evolve. We need to improve government. And so, kind of give me a little bit of flavor from, I know the CLO, but some other things of. Throughout your career, I'm sure you've built this understanding of some of the ways in which Oklahoma needs to adapt and change. It's probably part of your campaign, but give us kind of some of the flavor of the things you're seeing now, not necessarily the specific current events, but where does Oklahoma need to focus on? What do we need to look at about for our next 20 years?
Yeah. Well, I see some folks and some leaders actually who seem to feel like you can't have tradition and progress.
Yeah.
That you've got to have one or the other. And I'm convicted that the state can preserve its tradition but can also progress and evolve. And our system of government was tailored to the ideas, the thoughts, the concepts that were prevailing back in 1907. And so back then there was this view that there needed to be an empowerment process in government that really got a lot of people involved. And so the problem I'm seeing as the state's chief law officer is we've got a lot of boards and commissions that the governor really doesn't have authority over. I mean, once the governor appoints a member, they can only be removed for cause. And the complexity of not only the private sector but the public sector is a real challenge for somebody to come into Oklahoma City once a month and then be able to make informed decisions about the budget, about top personnel decisions. So if I were to recommend, and I have recommended to my clients who are the legislature,
Right.
I would really scale back boards and commissions and give the governor more command and control authority, have a rigorous confirmation process, but at the same time, particularly in a situation where you've got a challenged budget situation, you really need more authority to marshal resources, to find efficiencies. And in this climate, the governor's really handicapped. So the new governor ought to have that responsibility, I think.
And I think some people will get caught up on you're vesting more power with the governor, but really, at the end of the day, too, you're giving more accountability, too.
Yeah.
And for the people of Oklahoma, that accountability is what's important, too, correct? Because that's where some of the problems are. We're lacking in that.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
I think it's very accurate, Chad. There's a lot of frustration with the legislature and the governor. But the truth is the governor doesn't have a whole lot of authority to make decisions about education, about state government. And again, having a governor with more power, more authority, but more accountability, I like your assessment, is going to be good for the state.
Yeah. Well, if we want to lay the blame at their feet, let's at least give them the tools to go make the change.
Yeah,
correct?
well put. Well put.
So speaking of that, we've got some issues that are bubbling around that are going to probably come across your desk, and there's talks of initiative petitions, there's talk of veto referendum. So really wanted to talk about two things. One, kind of explain the Attorney General's role in that process. Good. And then two, for educators and our folks that are hearing about a potential veto referendum, kind of give us an overview of what your role would be in that as well, so we kind of understand kind of the current events that might be coming across your desk and or impact us.
Happy to. So the initiative and referendum process in Oklahoma is one that is I think in many ways a model for other states. So in order to initiate a change in the Constitution, in order to circulate signatures, your goal has to be you're going to have about 15% of the votes that were cast in the last gubernatorial election. So for a constitutional amendment, that's going to be about 120,000 votes. If you're just going to change the statute, it's 8%, which is I think somewhere around 80,000 vote signatures. And then lastly, if you're going to try to roll back legislation, it's called the veto referendum, you're going to need about 5% of signatures of the number of people who voted. So that's going to be about 40,000.
Okay.
So that's how you get on the ballot. That's how these things get teed up. We really don't get involved until the writing of the ballot title occurs. And our responsibility as the chief law officer entity of the state is to make sure that that ballot title is written so that people know what they're voting on. And so all these things can be challenged in court. The state question, its text can be challenged in court.
That's right.
The signatures can be challenged. And then there's the ballot writing process is actually sort of a joint venture between the Supreme Court and our office. And the Supreme Court doesn't always agree with how we write the ballot title.
They get to grade your work.
They do, and they have.
So if I remember correctly, and I always thought this was really interesting, one of the tools that your office uses is software to make sure that the language is kind of understandable. I think is it at 8th grade level, is that what they're trying to shoot for? So that basically anybody that can read it should have a simple understanding of what's being asked of them. Is that still in practice?
So that's not actually the actual standard, but that's something that in the back of our minds. We're still trying to make sure that it's easy to understand and it's written in a way that the average person can figure out what they're voting on.
Okay. And that makes tons of sense. If you're going to ask the people to vote on it, make it clear, make it understandable. Right. Because we're all standing there in the booth trying to read it, trying to understand it, and that's the key that's your job to make sure we can do that.
It is.
Great.
Yeah.
So the veto referendum, so particular piece of legislation, group doesn't like it, their process is what? They have to do?
So they have to begin circulating that petition, and so you essentially file notice with the Secretary of State, and then you've got interestingly enough, you've got until September to circulate your signatures and then submit them to the Secretary of State. Now, that's a tight window to get on the general election ballot because you've got to take into account legal challenges and you've got to take into account this ballot writing responsibility that we have with the Supreme Court. So it's possible, again, given the fact that you only need 40-something thousand signatures, that somebody could get those circulated, get them approved, withstand the court challenges, and then have that on the ballot in the general election. And so that would apply to anything that this legislature passes.
Okay. Okay. So it's available at any time.
It is.
Okay. And it hasn't been used very much either, I think.
The veto referendum has not been used much. It hasn't.
So that's an interesting. I didn't know much about it. I've heard some talk circulating. I think Dr. Coburn, Senator Coburn's group has potentially kicked that idea around, and we'll see if it goes anywhere. But I wasn't even aware, and so I thought that would be good to share with some of our folks because I'm not sure that they're aware that's a potential as well. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to kind of get into is being an advisor and a counselor to the officials that you work with. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on, particular maybe even on things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with your office, budgeting, revenue. How, what's a better way for Oklahoma to be thoughtful about the revenue base that we have? I particularly am concerned, as you know, just from our standpoint. We were opposed to the gross production tax increase, but we were really opposed to the continued dependence of Oklahoma on oil and gas production revenue. And you know as well as I, it's a very cyclical industry, and we have boom and bust cycles. And like I always say, we're always saying, Lord, give me one more boom, and this time we promise we won't mess it up. And unfortunately, that's going to be a part of this industry. So do you have some thoughts on, not necessarily the decisions that the legislature's made, but maybe the policies in terms of budgeting and some thoughtfulness on how do we get out of this boom and bust cycle?
Well, there is a statutory stabilization measures now that limit the ability of the legislature to spend more than the 5-year average of oil and gas revenues. That's helpful, but I know as well as you do that unfortunately the wild swings that occur with regard to natural gas and crude oil prices are historic. Right. And those swings are dramatic. The price of oil can be over $100 one year, and then it can be $40 the next. So does that average really assist in responsible budgeting? At the end of the day, you've got to have a revenue base, and this is civics. This isn't complex. You got to have a revenue base that has stability. And one of the things that Governor Keating and I worked on when we were at the Capitol together back in 2000 to 2002, the governor was trying to come up with a more modern revenue collection regime. And his view was the more that we can be similar to Texas, the better opportunity that we've got to compete with Texas for economic development and other states. So his view was taking the income tax way down, not incrementally down, and having more of a consumption tax approach made sense.
Broaden it out.
Yeah. But the incrementing down really doesn't accomplish anything. I mean, if you go from 6 to 4, you're really not moving the needle with regard to the state being attractive. So income tax is an important part of any revenue base because it's pretty stable, unlike gross production tax.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A lot of people ask kind of how did Oklahoma get in this situation, and I think there's a lot of misinformation, and educators I think are a little bit misled as well that it was this massive cut of taxes on the oil and gas industry that led to to this deficit, and really it's not. Really, it's we cut significant amount of money out of the budget with personal income tax reduction, but we didn't broaden the base out. So if there's any criticism of my fellow Republicans is that we depended on growth revenue that wasn't there, but we didn't build in a revenue mechanism to backfill. And so, and we were able to get away with it for a while when we had $110 oil. I take the job at the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association. I think I'm taking the blame. I take the job and immediately it goes from 110 to 30. So I don't know if it's me or what, but so I was able to inherit an industry that was in a lot of peril. So we haven't broadened out that base. No. So kind of thoughts on what does that broadening look like? Is it, broadening the sales tax base, or kind of give me a little bit more flavor on what that looks like.
Well, the revenue base needs to be sized, and it needs to be tailored to a modern economy. And so having a regime that's based more on consumption makes a lot of sense. Yep. And if you look at the states around the country that have moved to more of a consumption tax-based approach to revenue, those states are pretty resistant to swings in their economy, ups and downs, and honestly, they're flourishing. States like Washington, Texas. So where we go from here is in my view, critical.
Sure.
We need to evolve.
Right.
We need to have a revenue base that's, again, more tailored to the 21st century economy as opposed to the 19th century economy.
That's right. Well, we'll see, and you'll continue to advise, I'm sure.
I will advise.
And I'd be remiss, and my friend and yours, Chris Binge, would be mad if I didn't mention that the first time that revenue stabilization bill got introduced was a Binge bill, and it was exactly what he was looking at as well. So oil and gas revenue would go into a fund, and it would only allow a smoothed out portion of it to spill into GR, therefore kind of eliminating the ups and downs. And really at the end of the day, it was a kind of a handcuff in the legislature. You don't get to spend it all when it's there because it goes into the fund and it's a smoothing average out. And I think we're going to certainly have, if we're not willing to do some of the other things, then we need to maybe put some restrictions on that money. So I'm hopeful that the legislature, when they get through this session, and hopefully oil stays up in the 60s and drilling rigs are running, that we'll be able to do something responsible with it in the long term, and also couple with it some other reform as well.
I'll try to give the legislature and the new governor the best possible advice.
We're going to be counting on you. And the reason we're going to be counting on you is because of your other job that you have right now. You got two. You got your day job, and then you've got the running for re-election. And I think it would be remiss to get out of here without reminding everybody that you'll be running for election to a full term as Attorney General. So tell us a little bit about the campaign, kind of the general themes. And I know you've been traveling the state and meeting with folks. So kind of take us out on what you're seeing on the trail, how the campaign's looking, and kind of your optimism for Oklahoma.
Happy to. So the approach that our office has taken since I was appointed back in February of 2017 is the challenges of the office when Scott Pruitt was Attorney General in many ways were external. I mean, we had an administration who was really pushing the boundaries of executive authority in many ways, and attacking federalism, attacking basic, fundamentals of federalism and states' rights. So the office was well deployed in dealing with those challenges and was pretty successful, frankly. So we've tried to get back to basics, Chad, honestly, and the basics of this office are public safety. We do advise the state government, and that's a lot of what we do, but what we wake up in the morning and go to bed at night worrying about is keeping everybody safe. And so whether it's getting a handle on the opioid epidemic, whether it's fighting fraud and corruption, I mean, those have been a real focus of our office. We also take very seriously our responsibility to represent ratepayers at the Corporation Commission. And a number of cases pending that could mean hundreds of millions of dollars in costs being passed to ratepayers, and our job is to make sure that business, industrial, and residential ratepayers don't pay a penny more than what they should for reliable quality service.
Right. So not only are you the attorney for the agency heads and elected officials, you're really the attorney for the people of Oklahoma, and that's what you're really running to do. And I think there's really no probably better clarification that what you're doing on these rate cases is making sure that it's fair and defensible, and that they shouldn't pay more than is necessary. And so that's an important role, and I think people don't realize that the importance of the Attorney General in their everyday lives, and that's just a perfect example of it. Keeping us safe, keeping our wallets from being rated unfairly, and many other things. So
I like that.
It's the truth. It just is what it is. So again, he'll be on the ballot. And do you have a primary?
I don't have a primary or a general. As you know, filing is next week, so we'll see what happens.
So that would be fantastic. Save everybody the hassle, and then you can spend some more time focusing
on my day job.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you coming in. Appreciate your service to the state. A long history of service here, and it doesn't go unnoticed, and we really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for coming in, and thanks for turning in for another episode of OKOGA Live. We'll be back next week with another update on our friends up at the Capitol.